artificial voice.
Good afternoon. Those in McGregor 113 and those online, thank you so much for attending this first session of
Sound down.
Upstairs.
I'm probably not gonna stand, but we'll see.
mute their microphones. We'd appreciate it. This is the first session of a new series. It's called What We're Working On, and it's faculty discussing our scholarly and creative research and work. And the inspiration for this was as you know, we have a small faculty, but we really don't get a lot of opportunities to talk about our work, even with each other. So we wanted to create opportunities to do that. My name is Kevin Magruder. I am Associate Professor of History, and I'm doing this event in connection with another hat I wear, which is Faculty Fellow for Faculty Development and Diversity. And in that role, I look for ways to support faculty in whatever they need. And our scholarship is something that I've been particularly interested in, and creative practice in, been particularly interested in helping us to really get completed. So that's who I am. So these sessions, the way they work is we'll have two faculty, they'll each speak for about 20 minutes, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers. And today we have two faculty. Carrie Campbell is going to go first, and Bryan will follow. And I'll introduce them, kind of when they get ready to present. And you may know that Carrie Campbell is Associate Professor of French Language and Culture, and he's Program Director of the Languages and Culture program here. He has been here for over 10 years, 11 years, and in that role, he's played a really pivotal role in keeping our language program, which is focused on language proficiency, and it's somewhat unique as programs go, and he's been diligent in keeping that going. Carrie has a BA in French and a BA in linguistics from Brigham Young University, and an MA in French linguistics and literature from University of Pittsburgh, and a PhD level cultural studies certificate from University of Pittsburgh, and a PhD in French language and literature from the University of Pittsburgh, sorry. And without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to Carrie.
All right, this is a Zoom meeting, so all the wild cheering I can't hear. You're all mute, right? I'm gonna start my clock here and take a second to kind of set up some screen sharing. So I prepared a slides presentation to go along with this. And host disabled participant screen sharing. Do that. Cool. All right. Still one. I hit slideshow here. Are people in the Zoom session able to see this all right? Should say reading African nations allegorically, the subtitle of the week, imagine between self and world. And we have one voice confirmation, fantastic. I'm gonna hit start on this. This is the inaugural share out of what we're working on. And so there were some questions as to what the format should look like. It may evolve as time goes, and there may be differences between Brooks and mine. The approach I chose to take on this was not necessarily to present a work in progress and so much as to just give an overview of the kind of scholarly literary directions that I'm heading with a book project that I've been working on for a while, but haven't found full traction on. So what Dr. Magruder didn't mention was that I actually grew up in Canada, and I've got the map up here. I came from almost right where the arrow is pointing, Saskatchewan. And sometimes even when I say that word, other people say Gesundheit because they don't know what to make of this sound. I was taught as a youngster in Pierre Elliott Trudeau's Canada under a new constitution that was just flowering, that came about as at the end of an effort to sort of try to unify Canada as a country in a very Anglophone part of it. If you can see where the arrow is pointing over Montana, probably the closest French speakers to me were more like over top of Maine, thousands of miles away. And yet I was taught that they have the same rights as I do. And if they ever needed a service, they had the right to demand it in their native language, in French. And so there were French classes taught in all of my schools growing up. And I had to learn to think about being together, but not necessarily trying to imagine the community I have with others that are only theoretical to my own immature mind. Ernest Renan speaks about the problem of nationalism in his 1880s situation, where he's making an argument that the Alsace-Lorraine region that had been annexed by Germany should be brought back into the French political purview. And he goes through a list of different elements of nationality that may or may not prevail here, there, and otherwhere, and comes to the uneasy conclusion that it's really hard to define what a nation is. And he's not wrong still 150 years later, that religious unity doesn't necessarily translate to national unity, that ethnic or racial unity does not necessarily translate into nationality, that a shared history might be a sine qua non of nationality, but it's also insufficient by itself. Geography doesn't hold Canada together in any meaningful way, and yet they teach themselves that they are one nation. Do they? In Quebec, there are strong separatist leanings that twice in my lifetime, there's been referenda that very narrowly missed seceding Quebec from the rest of Canada. And there's a strong narrative of we are one nation inside another nation. And so just because there's a political unity of administration doesn't necessarily mean that there's not divisive forces that might think of themselves as separate rather than unified in some way. This connects me with Benedict Anderson's idea of his concept was that the mechanism that creates some kind of unity that's powerful enough to allow people the unifying principle it takes to think about maybe even sacrificing their own lives if necessary in defense of people that are just abstract to them, that may live thousands and thousands of miles away. But they're able to think of them as sort of family enough to potentially go to war for them. This kind of imagination only happens in print societies, where you have a common national media that are able to allow people to think of stories, think of cultural phenomena, think of styles of foods as belonging to the whole group, not just any particular region. That doesn't mean no regionalism exists and that it's not real. It just means that there is an imagined community across the entire nation. And Homi Bhabha comments on this a little bit later from a post-colonial perspective, thinking about mostly India and Britain and other aspects of the British Commonwealth. He realizes that states have sort of two separate needs when they're dealing with how to produce the unity that they produce. And one acts on the immediate, where they have to sort of perform to each other, perform to themselves that, we all have the same postal service, we all have the same health system, we all have the same driver's license process. We kind of teach each other in our day-to-day actions and our day-to-day brushings up against the state that we all belong to the same jurisdiction in some way. But that's insufficient by itself. There's also a need for countries to have to sort of teach in some way to their citizens that this cultural unity that has created an administration that
And they can't hear me as far as I know.
we have more. As people join in, you may want to quickly mute your own mic as you come in. We can try to catch you one by one here, but it's helpful that way. So so they constantly have to, states constantly have to teach their own citizens that they are one, that they maybe always have been one, and at least create some kind of mythology to suggest a reason, a historical reason for the togetherness that is now, that they have to participate in general. So I kind of understood how this plays out in Canada. I kind of understood how this plays out in the US with my long experience living here now. But if you talk to a Canadian, they will sing the same kids' songs. They will know the same current songs on the radios. They will talk about the Marvel Cinematic Universe the same way any American would. And yet, if you suggest to them that they're so culturally similar to the US that they should just be folded in as the 51st state, they will cry to high heaven that this is unjust and wrong. We are culturally distinct from those Southerners. The Québécois have always thought of themselves as a sort of linguistic and cultural island inside North America of English speakers that would engulf them if they weren't defensive about their identity. So there's these different ways in which there's nation and there's nation, and how you would interface with nation is important to me. In engaging with literature now, one of the things I found interesting, I'll get to Frederick Jameson in a little bit, but one of the ways I like to approach literature is to think of characters, plots, messages, the fictional worlds that authors create for us as trying to tell us something. And what do we get out of it? Well, that depends. You can have a reading from lots of different perspectives, but I've always thought that any two symbols that have some kind of connection to each other form some kind of system. And therefore, it's okay to read allegorically. And I wanna be careful about that word allegory, because some people, when I say allegory, what pops up in their head is, I don't know, medieval stories where a virtue becomes a person and is able to interact with people. And so you learn about how to be virtuous by embodying it in person and personifying the virtue. Or maybe you're thinking of things like Animal Farm, where you have a story of a farm, but it doesn't take too much understanding of Stalin's communist regime to know how Napoleon maps to Stalin and Snowball maps to Trotsky maybe, and the horse maps to the working class, et cetera, et cetera. There's an explicit, even though it's never actually stated in the book, there's an explicit way in which there's a one-to-one mapping of character to world or character to class inside Animal Farm. Instead, I think of the word allegory as a starting point for reading, as, okay, I've noticed that there's a symbol and it's related to another symbol and they're related to the world somehow. So what can I learn about the world now? Where can I take this? What is it trying to teach me that it looks at the world in this way, rather than am I trying to squeeze the world into the symbols? Does that make sense? So if I take, for example, I already mentioned the Marvel Cinematic Universe. I was just asking my class of African refugees this morning, because I'm teaching English, if they were aware of the Marvel stories, and they're like, yeah, we know all those movies. And so I said, well, how come it is that when Americans imagine movies, imagine characters, there always seems to be some kind of heroic, superhuman characteristic, and they go through great sacrifice and save the world? Do you think maybe there's a connection between how they think of themselves in the world as Americans and these superhero characters and the world they create for these superhero characters? I think there's a way to think about, it wasn't ever meant that, well, maybe with the exception of Captain America as a person, that all of the superheroes in the Marvel Cinematic Universe are supposedly representative of American attitudes toward what our role in the world is as Americans. It's not forcing them into a symbolism, it's seeing the symbolism in them to read it that way. And so you have to take a little bit of care in this kind of analysis to think about direction and fit world to fiction versus fiction to world. But Frederick Jameson takes another approach to this kind of allegorical situation, makes a very bold claim that it's not just, how can I put this? As a Marxist critic, his approach is that the world has been formatted by this field of capital into classes, and that maps out geopolitically into a first world, a second world, a third world. And it just turns out that if capital has a certain stature in your society and you belong to the first world, you can write love stories and they are just love stories. But if you belong to the third world, you can't just write a love story anymore. The reader always has to be aware that this love story is also always already commentary on the class relation. Economics is a master narrative that forces us to realize that there's a oppressor and oppressed relationship going on inside the text. And we have to read it allegorically, even if it claims only to be a love story, so that we can get from it the point that the oppression shouldn't exist anymore. Does that make a little sense? Yeah, so his book, The Political Unconscious, forms a very large backdrop to mine. I wondered if that process of thinking of economics, Marxist economics, as a master narrative, kind of pre-formatting the field of fiction, if that process might not be portable to other kinds of master or meta narratives. And I thought, from my experience in Canada and comparing that with the US, and then in my experience with Africa, maybe nation also is some kind of identity space where people in our modern society are almost forced by some hegemonic field to negotiate their identity space between self and world in some kind of locus, and the nation seems to fill that space. The thing is, African nations have a different history and are constructed differently in more complex ways than even the Canadian one nation inside another nation me could imagine. When I arrived there, I spent 2 years in Côte d'Ivoire and I had some wonderful experiences, but to walk through the points a little bit, if we are to take Woodrow Wilson's post First World War sort of 14 points doctrine on his League of Nations idea seriously, that each culture deserves, as part of its collective freedom, to have self-determination rights, how would that map then to Africa, where we now have 54 countries, but there are 2,000 plus languages, cultures, ethnicities on that continent? Would that imply 2,000 countries rather than the 54 we currently have? Those 54 have borders, almost 100% imposed upon them by European powers from historical forces. How does that work? Did some groups get put together that might have natural antipathies toward each other, or at least long-standing ones? Did those borders artificially maybe divide some with affinities toward each other? Oh yes, all over the place, all over the place. Thank you. I'll try to jump to it here a little bit. I think I do need to talk just a little bit about the history of it. The French African countries in the summer of 1960, all of them, France decided to drop its colonial holdings formally and allow political independence for all of them at once. It was kind of a strategic move to say, well, we're not going to control you anymore, but here's our cooperators, and we will send those instead, and we will have a neo-colonial connection with you, not a colonial connection with you. And that led to new possibilities for authors to imagine what their nation was if they were in political control of it. This is a little bit important because that particular period in the literary history of Francophone Africa was massively significant. There were probably more than dozens of novels and poetry anthologies published before 1960 by many, many African authors speaking in French and writing in French. At 1960 to 1968, there were a sum total of, I think, 3 novels published in that time. Not because nobody wanted to write, well, partly because many of those authors were also part of the educated class that was quickly recruited into government function, and so they didn't have any more time to write. Part of it was also because they needed a waiting space. What's going to happen now that we're in charge? And one of the novels that I'm about to comment on was one of the first published in that, right after that space ended in 1968. And it's cynically, sarcastically, bitingly critical of the African leaders that came after the independence. And it kicked off a wave that some called Afro-pessimism, although that's an unfair term and it doesn't capture what the term suggests by itself. So 30 years later, after this, well, I mean, first of all, 1960, where are we? We're in the middle of the Cold War. We have a polarized world and Western International Monetary Fund propping up dictators all over the place. At the end of that period, I happened to be in Côte d'Ivoire for its first actual contested election. The Berlin Wall fell. There was no more supposedly Red Scare by which to justify propping up dictators. And so, doggone it, if you want our IMF money, you're going to have multi-party elections. And so the first contested election in Côte d'Ivoire, there was this really odd thing that happened. The handpicked successor to the former 30-year dictator started talking up this Ivoirité concept, this we're all Ivorian here concept, with his left hand, and with his right hand, he found a way to exclude his one major political party's only candidate, because he didn't happen to have 2 Ivorian parents on his pre-colonial, pre-independence birth certificate. So it was an obvious ploy move, and so there were 3 political parties. The one that did this went forward, got 94% of the vote, because the other 2 parties banded together and said, if you're going to be this unfair, we're both going to quit. But within 4 years, that same president had a coup d'etat foisted upon him. The next 10 years were spent in turmoil and undecided elections. At no point in Côte d'Ivoire was any of the discussion, you're terrible, we're going to secede. The discussion was, include us more. We want you to be fair. We want to be Ivorian together. We believe in this Ivoirité, even if it was cynically used against us. And so what does the nation mean here? What does it mean for 60 different ethnic groups to think of themselves as one? I'm going to bust out the novel itself and do a quick, oh, I'm at 20 minutes, maybe. Can I take 3 more? Sure. This is the book I was talking about, Les Soleils des Indépendances from Amadou Kourouma. He lived in exile immediately after writing this for reasons. And it's his first few words, the first sentence is what I've got on your screen here. The first 2 sentences are what I've got on the screen here. It has been gone through with a fine-tooth comb in the literary, in the critical literature. Much of the first reading, and I won't explain a whole ton of this anti-colonialist reading, where the text in red, many of the first African commenters noticed that it was bad French, and the French noticed that it was bad French. Why didn't he say, it's been a week since Conan Ibrahima of Malinke race was finished off, or did finish. There's a need in French for you to use the être auxiliary if you're going to use the word finished as a substitute for died. But they used avoir as the auxiliary, and the scholar said, look, the Malinke thought is bleeding through the French language. And so this means that the colonial situation was always a false promise. It never could allow us full expression of our inner selves. We have to translate, we have to not be authentic. There was an influential critic called Christopher Miller from Yale that took that a little bit further and noticed that right before the end of the paragraph, it's where it says, let's say this in Malinke, that he was setting up an expectation that it would be in Malinke, but then ended up writing in French. So the point is that an even stronger anti-colonial or post-colonial reading that I'm trying to squeeze down in time and not being able to articulate well here as I'm trying to think too many things at once. Let's say that Malinke comes out in French as a commentary that no Malinkeness is allowed at all. Does that make a little sense? Which is a little bit stronger than, we do have a Malinkeness, we're trying to be authentic, but French won't allow it. Now the argument is, this doesn't work at all. As I was reading, I noticed two different moves. That if you take this as, if you take the let's say it in Malinke and think of that as sarcastic rather than setting up an expectation. Now you're forced to realize that the Malinke expression is written in French, and you're getting an initiation into Malinkeness as you read through the French. And then when you move on to wonder who he's saying us to when he says, let's say it in Malinke, now you have the sort of basis to think, well, instead of thinking of this as a question of ethnic purity, instead of thinking of this as a question of anti-Western resistance, why don't we take this text for what it is, a representation of the fraught nation that the Côte d'Ivoire was at the time. When he's saying, let's say it in Malinke, he's not actually failing to give Malinkeness to the French. And he's not also able to give the full Malinkeness to the Malinke. But that describes perfect. I couldn't describe better how the colonial situation in Côte d'Ivoire is. Does that make a little sense? So what I'm currently working on, and that's the overview, what I'm currently working on is I've done a deep dive into Côte d'Ivoire, and I'm branching out now. I'm looking at Guinea, at Senegal, at Cameroon, and some other places in the formerly French African colonies, and also moving to what they're calling Afropolitan authors like Alain Mamankou and Fatou Diom, and thinking about how their placelessness or location in France troubles the concept of writing about nation in this way. So I'll leave that with you. Sorry, I took a little extra time myself before this. Created materiality, futural aesthetics. And let me take that away.
Hey guys, we brought donuts if anybody wants any. Thank you.
I think you're gonna have to twist my arm.
We're gonna take a couple seconds to set up. So Brooke Bryan will be next. She is Associate Professor of Writing and Aesthetics and Program Director, Writing, Managing Director of the Antioch Review and Antioch Writers Workshop. And those many hats show what her versatility has been in the over 10 years that she's been here full-time faculty member. Brooke has a BA in Humanities from Antioch University and an MA in Humanities in Oral History, Methodology, and Sound Studies, also from Antioch University. And she is a PhD candidate in Philosophy, Aesthetics, and Art Theory from the Institute for Doctoral Studies in Visual Arts. So Brooke Blackman, Bryan.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you for being here in the room. Each of you, I hope to have great conversations with, and thank you to all who are joined in the, what do I do? Oh, thank you to all who are in the, Kevin is getting me fixed, who are in the Google Meet. I appreciate your time and being here today. I've already learned something, which is that Carrie and I are both readers of Frederick Jameson. Jameson has an idea of the copiously reproduced art object that is a fundamental secondary source in my work. Kevin is getting us sorted so you all can see. Thank you. Okay. So I'm going to go over basically what is my dissertation. Give a sort of overview of the framework of what my research has been over the last, let's just say 7 years. We can go as weird as we want in the questions if we have time for discussion. I hope that it's a jumping off point. If anyone has connected ideas, I thought I would first start by reading the abstract of my actual paper, which I rewrite obsessively, but it is currently my best articulation of what this work is and how it hangs together. And then we're going to proceed through 3 acts. We're going to look at 3 different types of artwork, 3 different artworks to kind of go through this overview. And then I'll leave us with the theory set that I'm working with, kind of the movement between key thinkers in the continental canon that I'm working with, which are Heidegger, Levinas, Deleuze, and the ways that those figure into some major concepts at play in the continental philosophy canon and in the theory of art and philosophical aesthetics that I'm working in. So without further ado, I don't know if you guys can see this properly. I feel as though I might need to make it full screen instead of slideshow. I don't know anything on Google Slides.
It's fine as is.
Okay, we'll proceed. All right, so the title of my project is Liberated Materiality, Futural Aesthetics and the Conservation of Art. And here's my abstract. This project charts how classical conservation thinking misunderstands the work of art in ways that reproduce significant metaphysical and ontological deficits that have been long at issue for continental philosophy. It imagines how we might liberate objects ascribed an art function from the oppressive metaphysics of stability and presence and its legislative authority, the museum, in favor of a futural ethical aesthetics, where instantiation and virtuality prevail over occurrence and preservation. With Heidegger, we will think beyond saving an art object such that it can remain in its former continuance, and instead ask with Deleuze how we might engage its forces and effective capacities through practices of virtuality, individuation, or differentiation, glimpsing toward a model of the work that emphasizes its futurity. To do so, we will unpick concepts of reversibility, author's intent, originality, and authenticity, these concepts that undergird the contemporary conservation thinking mandate for how art objects are to be handled, used, cared for, or saved. Distancing from what I see as all too corporeal aesthetics of degradation that are found through the new materialisms, I will trace the ontological emergence of objects turned art, such as ephemeral folk craft, African-American improvisational quilts, and old cars. Seeking a radical reappraisal of how we understand art and how preservation might allow us to interact with its forces and effective capacities, this project pieces together an aesthetics of futurity while pondering the value of ephemerality for the art to come. So that's a lot, right? Hi, welcome. This is the kind of project that can be easily misunderstood, right? It's almost polemical in its framing. But the true question that I'm aiming for is, what is the value of ephemerality right? That's a hard one for Western culture. Rosie Berdati, who is a contemporary scholar in the New Materialism, says that the Western world doesn't know how to die. We don't know how to think of death. And I think that's true in every aspect. And my particular entry point into this conversation is that I have found that I am attracted to and curious about objects that we have recently ascribed an art function to. So in this program that I've been part of, a big part of what we look at, what we study, the canon that we read is, what is the function of art, right? Why is art different from, why is an art object different from some other kind of art object? What are we doing when we make art? What is the value or the function of art in any given era, right? Why are artists important? Why did Plato expel artists from the ideal republic? There's a reason, right? Art does something, it's special. So I'm really interested in things that were very recently not art, that have recently been ascribed an art function or brought under the phantasm of art. Phantasm comes from one of my thinkers, Rainer Sherman. Sherman, you can think about a phantasm almost like a hegemonic structure, right? This all-encompassing worldview that we hardly know how to conceive of things or ask questions outside of, right? So this phantasm of art. And my worry is that there are some objects that people have lived in relation to over time. My own particular expertise lies in the quilt, but I have expanded that to other forms of social practice and ephemeral art and other things that are, in many people's minds, not art. But the idea is that I worry that when we call something that has not been art, we too quickly rush to remove it from its relations, from its use, right? Use values are not something that has been highly esteemed since Kant in art theory, right? So the idea here is how can we look at objects turned art and that have been, in order, once they have this special function of art, we have to save them, we have to remove them from their relations, remove them from their use values, and oftentimes find ways of conserving, preserving, and thinking about how we care and handle for them in special ways. And that has led to the conservation thinking that pervades the art industry and the museum industry to apply a contemporary conservation strategy, a contemporary conservation theory that has been long at play in the free and fine arts, right? Painting, sculpture, etc. Uncritically, I would argue, uncritically to these other objects that have just now been deemed art. And I'm afraid that something is lost. I'm afraid that something is lost. So we're gonna move through, that is by way of my introduction. We're gonna move through. I think we're gonna move through our slides. Okay, so we're gonna push through in 3 acts. I think I can do it. And the first act is really kind of an examination. If you think about this as my first chapter, this is really sort of an examination of author's intent and how we encounter art in the first place. I became fascinated with a particular artist whose name is Anna Lukács. She had an exhibit at the Tate right in the height of COVID. Unfortunately, I was unable to go. But Anna had done this work with Transylvanian peasants and farming communities in Transylvania. So with over decades, from the 60s to the, what are her decades actually? Let me get to my right slide. From 1964 to 1976, she was doing this as a sort of community social practice. She was visiting and living with Romanian farmers, and she was engaged in this annual harvesting of the wheat. And through that process, she worked with the artist to create what you might call wheaten wreaths, but more so, these are sculptures. They are wreaths that are sculptural forms that are installed in the community. And she did this annually each year. And then eventually, in about maybe 1980 to 1985, she realized that the community was changing so much that she wasn't going to be able to continue to make these wreaths annually with the community. The community was changing, young people were moving. Social, political, historical forces were such that this active annual social practice with this community was no longer going to be possible. And so she blinked, right? And realized that all of these forms installed in this community that they had made over this decade-long process, that these forms were now precious, that they had to be conserved in some way because this was no longer an ongoing art project with new works. And so in that process, which leads all the way through sort of like 1980 to 1985, she was actually she describes her work in 3 phases, and it kind of goes from the 80s into the early 2000s, where she ends up contracting with a team of Hungarian metal workers to create these steel encasements for the work. And so the question that she asked was, how do we, since we cannot make work any longer with this community, and since the work that this community has made is decaying, right? It has an actual lifespan in the community. We can see that the works we have made are being, they're experiencing deterioration due to weather. So she worked with Hungarian artists to create these tin encasements for the work. And this is the exhibit at the Tate. What you have is, I would put sort of a Benjamin focus on the photos. You have a lot of photo documentation of the process, and then the works themselves are actually inside these tin encasements. And so what's interesting to me about this, and this has been met to a lot of critical acclaim, people have been really excited about this work, and I'm also excited about this work, but I don't know how the work makes me feel. I don't know if we're doing right by the work in this way, but I also don't know that we're not. So the trajectory that's of interest to me for this work, the solemn process, is that first, we had works that were allowed to be ephemeral because there was a concept that new works would always be being made. When the new works became not able to be continually co-created, the works that were previously allowed to be ephemeral became precious. And so the idea of saving those works became the paramount next step for this project. And so the social practice engagement with the Hungarian artist, I think the metal workers, the tin workers, is very interesting. But the question I brought to the table here in terms of a theoretical lens is, what is this pathway of discomfort that we feel when we know, when we recognize, when we have to do an honest account of the fact that everything is coming into and passing out of existence, right? How do we deal with that? How do we grapple with that reality? In this instance, we saved the works by encasing them in other works. And so from a Heideggerian lens, which comes from his origin of the work of art, but also for me, another essay that I hold very close together that kind of helped me with my theoretical lens is the question concerning technology. So on the one hand, Heidegger would ask, how do we encounter the work? How are we encountering the work? Can we encounter the work at all, is my question. The original work being the Wheaton Reeds. How do we encounter that work now that it's encased in tin encasements? And a bigger picture question here from the question concerning technology is, Heidegger asked the question in the question concerning technology. I think it's an overlooked question. It's really important. It's the question of, what does it mean to save something? He says, when we save something, does it mean that we are seizing something from immediate ruin? Is that what we mean when we say to save? Or does to save something actually mean something different? Does it mean that we have to fetch something home into its essence, right? Now, we can have some discussion about Heidegger and his frameworks and how to define essence and origin in all of his work. Those are conversations I would love to have. But I think the important piece here for me is, have we saved the work or have we created a new work? And how are we to wrestle all of this down in along the concept of ephemerality? And are we able to create works, and are we able to let works die? So this is the first act. Largely grounded, you can consider this a first chapter, largely grounded in a theoretical analysis of author's intent, originality, and that idea of how we encounter a work and whether we can save a work. In my second act, I'm focused more on originality and repetition. This is kind of my favorite chapter. What was originally my whole entire project was looking at the quilt as a quilt maker and a quilt collector, and quilt enthusiast in general. I'm very familiar with the historic origins and different regionalisms and practices of the quilt. In this case, we're going to talk about Rosie Lee Tompkins, who is an African-American quilt maker whose family moved from the South to the Oakland area. And she is of great interest because over her lifetime, a collector by the name of Eli Leon collected just about everything she could produce. In fact, the more I got into my research, I realized that not only was he simply purchasing the works that she had made, but he actually came to commission her to make works faster. He was almost a compulsive collector of African-American outsider art in the Bay Area. And recently he passed away and donated his entire collection to the Berkeley Art Museum and Pacific Film Archive, making that organization the single, arguably, perhaps the greatest holder of outsider African-American art, but definitely the largest holder of textiles that are quilted outside of the quilt world, where there's a University of Nebraska has a quilt museum. So this is all very interesting, and the more I learn about Eli Leon, the more interesting it becomes. This is a work by Rosie Lee Tompkins. What you'll notice is beyond just kind of the visual excitement of the work, there is there's both pattern and randomness in her work. There's a vivaciousness to the color and to the form. So what she is doing is working with traditional patterns, including 9-patch blocks, half square triangles, things that are traditional to the quilt community in terms of named patterns that are oftentimes made and remade into new patterns, which also have names, you might know. But not oftentimes with as much glee, right? Not oftentimes with as much what Eli Leon will go on to call improvisational form. But what is more interesting in her work is her embroidery and the mantras. So almost all of her work includes some amount of embroidery. You can see that there's a real aesthetic style to her pieces. And all of them, you can see more on the whole cloth quilts, they all bear these names and dates in very repetitive fashion. So Rosie Lee Tompkins is of interest to scholars because one, this massive amount of work that has been taken in, and also two, because she is, she's a remarkable quilt maker for a lot of different reasons. So the idea here for me, Rosie Lee Tompkins was it's very interesting to get into her life story, and I'm trying to avoid what is sort of biographical backstories in this project in order to focus on kind of the ontological emergence of work. But Rosie Lee Tompkins is a really interesting individual, and Eli Leon, it seems, challenged forth new works from Rosie Lee Tompkins. Rosie Lee Tompkins is not her real name, that's her pen name for the purposes of her work and where she sold. So let me just get back to my thoughts here. So what is of interest to me in the quilt is that very rarely does a entire quilt come together with just one maker. It's very traditional that quilts, both in every regionalism of the American quilt, from the New East, the New England on the East Coast with the idea of the dowry to that conspicuous sort of domesticity to the Deep South, African-American quilts, and almost every documented regionalism of the American quilt. It's very typical that one quilt is made by many makers. That means either people will piece together or they will quilt together. Oftentimes old quilts are encased within new quilts. You can see the parallel there to the encasement of the tin wreaths. But there is an examination that needs to be had in the world of quilt making. So far, it really focuses, people who write about the quilt have focused on kind of that historical, biographical piece of the quilt. And I'm interested in how do we consider a quilt as a whole work? If that work in and of itself is necessarily archival, made of many pieces, In the minds of most quilt makers, there's a question as to when the quilt takes its full form, when it can be unpicked, repieced, put back together. There's a question of who the maker is, if the maker who does the piecing or the maker who does the quilting. There's a variety of different parts of the work that can challenge very closely held ideas of originality and authenticity that we think about when we think about the author. So in this section, I'm really concerned about the author. Who is the author? Authorship, like in a Foucault kind of sense of, deconstructing some of the Western ideas about who the author is and why we ascribe this special function. And the quilt is a really great place to do so because many of these quilts have been made and remade multiple times by multiple women. And so without further ado, I apologize, that is my phone ringing, but I'm going to push through with the idea that it soon will stop ringing. The third act here is even further out from what many people would call art. I'm looking at old cars. And the reason I'm looking at old cars is because one, I wanted something to be able to talk to my dad and other people around the dinner table instead of being so esoteric that everyone's eyes glaze over. But really, old cars are interesting because one, you can imagine some of the Deleuzian senses of affect and force, like force is the affective capacities of a work. Two, cars are interesting because so many people own them. And because they're in garages and in the same way as the quilt, many people have the American, some version in their family of the American quilt saved in zippered bags in their closet, and they cherish it too much to bring it out, or some people's quilts are still in use. It's the same thing with the car. Many people own old cars, and there are a variety of easily digestible, legible ways that people think about, do I have to preserve this car as it is as such? Can I make and remake this car? Can I do a resto mod versus an authentic repair with period replacements? So the car community, and also it kind of bridges from art to design, right? So this has been an interesting and unexpected, but interesting way in which I've moved in this work, in my research. This is a picture of a 911 Porsche, arguably one of the most classic cars for those who are really into old cars. And this particular car is owned by and restored and maintained by, or remade, we should say, remade by a particular character whose name is Magnus Walker. I first got interested in Magnus Walker because he was early in the LA scene, a person who was big in the upcycling community, which is part of what I'm exploring in chapter 2. How do you take things and remake them into other works? And he created kind of a clothing brand and industry out of this. And as I listened to him, I realized that he actually is a collector of Porsches. So when he started collecting old cars, he was automatically wanting to make and remake them and rebuild them. And if you were a Porsche devotee, you might recognize that this car has features what he calls grafting on. This is not an original Porsche. So he was considered a pariah in the Porsche community because he was willing to take this classic car that was considered authentic, original, important, and he started cutting up these cars and adding things that didn't belong. Fins where there should have been a fastback where there should have been fins, different wheels, different fenders. He cuts up the cars and regrafts new aesthetic elements into the cars. And at this point, he's done so with a number of Porsches. I don't know how many 911s there are in the world, but you can imagine how someone who has made money through developing an industry and a fashion brand, and then takes a liking to a particular collector's sensibility, right? This is taboo because he's not just buying one or two cars, he's buying a lot of 911s. But it turns out over time that he becomes pretty well accepted and is now a speaker in the Porsche community. So this idea of the outlaw Porsche is interesting because it shows where there's a community of interest that has accepted and is excited by this idea of making and remaking something that otherwise could be considered precious, authentic, and original. I feel as though my time is getting a little close, so am I? Okay. So I'm sorry if this is small, but I wanted to sort of close out with a return to sort of my theory set and what I'm working with here and the picture that I'm kind of trying to paint towards the conclusion. So you know, if I had to say the whole work is really a question of what does it mean to save something? What is the value of ephemerality? Why in the Western world and the Western canon, where we have this emphasis on this stability, this idea that the world is a stable world, right? This is the metaphysics of stability and presence, that everything can come into, that I'm a perceiving subject, that I have the capacity to perceive a known world, that I can measure what I encounter, that I can order it and categorize it and figure out what my greatest use value is of that object. This is the Continental Canon's critique of the Western worldview. And so when you start to really look at this metaphysics of stability and presence and the troubles that it has caused us being humanity, you start to see that there are other resources available, both outside the Western canon over the long haul, and also in contemporary continental philosophy, where people are trying to think beyond the subject. And some people call this posthumanism, and sometimes affect theory and new materialisms are some secondary sources that I've been dabbling in. But there's a problem in a lot of this secondary literature because everyone is still focused on what is incorporeal. And Deleuze, after Heidegger Levinas, and some others, Deleuze comes in and says, I think maybe we have some things we need to reconsider. I think maybe the way that we understand what is present needs to be overturned. And so Deleuze is oftentimes credited with an overturning of Platonism. And Deleuze does that by really re-articulating this relationship to identity, right? The identity of stuff. Like this object has a particular isness about it, right? So refiguring identity by focusing not just on what is corporeal, like what is present as an art object, but what is incorporeal about that object that can be turned into what Deleuze calls simulacra. And simulacra is not, if you're familiar with like Baudrillard simulacra, Deleuze's simulacra is the goal. It's the idea that for something to have a future, for something to exist in its virtuality and multiplicity, that it's a refiguring of this idea between what Kant would call, really the whole entire Plato-Kant framework for reality. Deleuze wants to refocus on the incorporeal and on affective capacities and on forces and how a work is not a future because of its identity, but that it's the concept that finds its way into different instantiations of form. So when I look at ideas like the Wheaton Reeds and artists and how they want to maintain their work into the future, when I look at the quilt and how the quilt has always been for makers, a fluid concept of multiple instantiations of its form, right? And when I look at something like a car, like an outlaw, resto, mod, different instantiations of the form, which actually allow us to continue to encounter the work. And it presents an opportunity to think about an art object in a way that doesn't mean preserving it in its former continuance, preserving its identity, its physical form, but exploding that form into multiple modes so that it becomes simulacra. I know this is complex and kind of at a level where there's a lot of words and terms it's difficult to get at in a 20-minute talk. But in general, if you see my little diagram here, we're moving from this idea of disclosure to difference. From the way that Plato, Aristotle, the pack contingent, Western thought in general thinks about how objects come to be, how they are disclosed into being, to one of difference, where things can be exploded into future forms. We're moving from this concept of the original and its connected ideas of, an original has to have an author, an original has to be authentic, an original can't be, its originality can be impacted. So we're moving from that idea of what is an original to this idea of simulacra, that any instantiation of form is just one instantiation. And the best way to preserve something is perhaps to explode it into multiple instantiations. From identity, which is the whole problem with the Western canon, to thinking about forces and capacities, and from the corporeal to the incorporeal. So present within a lot of these things are the idea of time, right, duration, an overhaul of the idea of originality and abandoning, Deleuze would say we have to abandon the idea of the original entirely, and the author. And so my concluding chapter focuses on, what is the value of ephemerality? Can art with its special function be allowed ephemerality, right? And what might the museum to come look like if we know that when we take objects into the museum, such as the quilt, we move it from its relations, its social relations, any possibility of making and remaking, and we hang it on a wall for distant regard. That prescribed spatial order in a museum where we have to view an object from a particular vantage point. Docents don't want you to step along, reach over the line. That prescribed spatial conceptual territory of the museum is exactly what has been at issue for contemporary continental philosophy. And so what does it mean when we take art and allow it no freedom there? So my conclusion is around what is the museum to come, and what kind of a museum, what kind of preservation might be allowed the art to come. Thank you very much for getting here with me.
Thank you, Brooke. We have about 30 minutes where we can entertain questions, comments, conversation, and just be sure. So what I'm going to do, the second microphone here, did somebody?
Robert Goldsmith has a question.
Robert, if you could unmute and ask your question, please.
Still muted.
Excusez-moi. OK. Est-ce que Carrie est disponible? Est-ce Carrie est belle? Carrie, est-ce que tu m'entends?
Oui, oui, oui.
OK, c'est drôle parce que probablement c'est la première fois que je vais parler avec toi en anglais pour le reste de l'audience. This is a subject, what you were talking about, I certainly have a lot of empirical experience with, given the fact I've lived in 4 different cultures in 2 different languages, 3 different languages, and hold multiple passports. I don't want to dominate the conversation between you and I at the moment, but I will say one thing is that when you speak about Canada, there's definitely an Anglophone bias on your part on how you presented certain points. I don't want to go into detail here. It's not worth it.
Absolutely. I totally understand that.
But what you did say about Africa, I spent 2 months living in Nigeria. And of course, you understand it better than I, but I saw exactly what you were talking about. Obviously not regarding the French language in Nigeria. But what I was going to say is, if you have a class that you wanted to, where you want 2 scenarios, if you have a class on this subject, I'd love to participate, because I certainly have comments to make. Or secondly, if you want to discuss this outside of this forum, I'd love to talk to you about it as well. Up to you.
Let's definitely pick that up. Also, I will be doing a world lit class over the lunch break this very spring term. So I don't know if there's ways to port somebody like you in, but that would be wonderful to.
Well, one way you could do is just with a speakerphone, or anything like that.
Yeah. No, we have tools available. It's a matter of figuring out how to make it work.
Okay. The other thing I'd say is it might be worthwhile for you to talk to me beforehand to find out if I'm completely off on a tangent that is no pertinence as far as you're concerned. C'est parce que peut-être je suis complètement fou, Carrie. C'est un scénario possible.
We've known each other a while. I've never found that to be the case. And frankly, even if you are a little fou, I think the exact folie that you bring into the classroom would help whatever students there to understand there's multiple perspectives on everything. We you get down to the understanding of each other.
Well, comme une chose, la classe va être plus animée.
Thank you, Robert. Shay, may I-
OK, contactez-moi quand tu as un intérêt pour le rencontre avec la classe, d'accord?
Je le ferai.
OK, merci, ciao.
Shay?
Kevin, did you say my name?
Yes.
Well, I thank you both. I'm so glad that this series has started up. I hope I can make every single one. It's really a delight to have this kind of time to listen and learn from the two of you. This is maybe going to seem a little offbeat, Brooke, but I was thinking, I couldn't help thinking about TAC and the shift from object to force, the shift from what is structured to what is flowing. And the idea, Kevin was also involved in these conversations about how power has shifted in this way globally due to our interconnectivity with the internet. And it behooves those of us who want to change the world to think of power in these terms, because there's tremendous power to be tapped. So I just can't help wondering if you see any connections there.
Thank you, Shay. I think you're speaking about a book called New Power, which I know was circulated around staff and administration and the board at one point in time. I never actually read the book, so I can't speak to those concepts of how I can't speak to the framing of those concepts, but we were involved for a while in institutional strategic planning around a group called TAC, T-A-C. And that idea was Think, Act, Connect. And that TAP group, I do believe, Shay, just from participating, I do think it was a very generative group in that it was trying to truly become nimble around the ways that different aspects of the organization could work together and different concepts of communication flows, both internal communications and outward facing communications. And while a lot of this seems very administrative or prescriptive in terms of, we're talking about the business of an organization, I do think that the ideas that pervade thinking about organizations in that way are very much coming from whatever you want to call this new moment. I do think it has to do, I think people ask all the time, what does philosophy do? And I think, well, philosophy is the only thing, ideas are the only thing that have ever done anything. And so I do think that there is kind of a different sensibility that is tracked by the philosophical canon. I do think that globalism and the idea of, the immediacy of communications and communication streams are part of it. But I do think that this concept of getting stuck from fixed entities and trying to sustain and preserve a fixed concept, a fixed identity, is very crucial for any good work today. And so in that way, when you think about moving from, how to explode what was real and right about an entity into multiple different flows and new forms, I do think you avoid what Jameson calls, a bygone work, or what Heidegger would, consider to be a perished work, and what Deleuze would actually also call a bygone work. And so in a sense, all of us in the new era of Antioch, we are all trying to figure out what is crucial and necessary, what is the isness of Antioch that needs to move forward, and how to imagine new flows of institutional possibility in a new historical moment. So in that way, I do think the work is powered by some of these ideas.
We have a question from McGregor 113.
Hello, this is Pamela. I'm a student. My pronouns are she, her. Your presentations were great, by the way. I also wanted to ask Carrie, since we're talking about the stuff that you guys have been doing recently, Carrie, you were recently featured in our Herndon Gallery, representing, a piece of your art, and I wanted to ask you about it at the time, and I thought that now might be a good time to ask you. You wrote a piece of music, and for people who weren't able to go to the immaculate presentation of our faculty and staff artwork, you could hear Carrie's piece playing in the Herndon while you looked at other people's art. And I wanted to ask you about it, Carrie.
Oh, thanks for the question. Yeah, so I have multiple identities and some of them are patchworks as well. And yeah, so the scholarly efforts that I'm working toward are engaging a lot of these ideas of what is an identity, what is a national identity. But I've always also had some musical aptitudes. I can't play any single instrument well enough to perform it, but my brain's always alive with what my ears can do, and I can sing half decently, but in the last few years, I've kind of picked up the opportunity to grab other people's works and write arrangements of music, which is not to say original composition, but making them new and fresh and your own in a way that I think maybe quilting can provide a great parallel to in so many ways, where the authorship is problematized. And I have very practical reasons for some of that. The particular religious community I am involved in doesn't have a paid ministry, and so we kind of rotate around assignments for whatever needs done. And music's always been a part of worship, and so mostly my compositions in the last few years have been responding to a calling to help with the choral music. So it's been 4-part harmony and various, mostly keyboard instruments, but this latest one that was in the Herndon came out of the COVID period. I had kids at home, each with band instruments, but nothing to play together, no people to play with, and so I put together a weird ensemble. You don't usually hear bassoons and French horns and clarinets and flutes all together, but I thought this particular hymn worked out well. And the message of it was, I mean, the title of it is "Be Still My Soul," and the message of it is about what you're going through right now. If you're looking far enough ahead to the right sources, you'll be able to make it through. And whether or not you believe the same things about a Christian Savior that I do, you should at least be able to understand that sentiment. We all have things that are in our way, and we all have things we need to connect with that are higher up than just ourselves, that can see us through the difficulties that we have.
A few years ago, Carrie recruited me to be a part of an ensemble for an arrangement he did at one of their services. That was really fun. Also, Carrie, this past Sunday, I went to see Imani Winds in Cincinnati, which is a Grammy Award-winning woodwind quintet. Bassoon, French horn, flute, can't remember the other. But I'll send you a link to them. It was fantastic. Yeah. Other questions, either in the room or online? In the room.
Hello, my name is Eli Liberty. I'm Dave Dunn, and I have a question for Professor Bryan. So I was wondering, especially towards the end of your presentation, whenever you were talking about kind of the sort of like future of museum space and preservation and kind of that. I mean, like really the whole crux of your thing is this conflict between preservation and like keeping something safe and pristine and its sort of original use context. And that made me think a lot about like objects in more of a like historical and archaeological context within the museum space. Because that's like typically where, like what I think, like typically whenever I'm thinking about objects that were created for a specific use and that were used by people, being preserved in a museum space, it is in more of that historical archaeological type of a context as opposed to a fine art context. And I'm wondering, like, is that something that you're kind of engaging with through this project, or something that you're kind of in conversation with at all?
Yeah. Thank you. I haven't written the conclusion yet, so I still don't exactly know what I'm doing with it. No, you make a really great point, because part of, in my preface and introduction, I just explicitly say I'm not going to be dealing with, painting, sculpture, the fine arts, because so many others have dealt with these objects, and there is a significant amount of conversation, really just opening, that is outside the scope of my particular project. But some of that is really, really interesting, right? Thinking about the repatriation of objects, whether they're art or whether they're artifacts. I think that some disambiguation of the terms and some framing, how does something become an artifact versus, the things that we consider artifacts that are, sort of held in archives, how do they allow us to story certain ideas of cultural heritage, whether those stories are storied by a particular, party, and, whether those objects can tell different stories than the stories we've allowed them to tell before, where are the absences in the archive? I think all of these are really, really important aspects of the museum to come, right? In this particular, in my particular area of focus, I'm really interested in, if all quilts, for instance, get called art, then what ethico-aesthetic can guide our decisions with those quilts that will never be accessioned into a museum, because they might not be exemplary instantiations of a particular pattern. They might not have exquisite detail. Why do museums collect? What do they collect for? So I think those are all really important questions. And I think that my overall take would be, anytime we build an archive, we're oftentimes building that archive to tell a story that we already aim to tell. And I wonder if that script can be flipped as we look at what's in the archive and who placed it there, and what are the, different relations that create the conditions of possibility for that archive and those objects, and what stories might they be able to tell otherwise. The last thing I'll say is there's this really exquisite story by Alice Walker called Everyday Use. And I think I've shared it with folks in some of my classes, but Everyday Use is a story written about a sister who goes off and becomes kind of educated. And when she comes home to her home in the Deep South, there's a sister who was maimed in a fire and has not left the home and become educated. And Mama is kind of the teller of the story. And Alice Walker just does a phenomenal job creating tension between the sister who comes home from the city, who's looking to collect objects of antiquity from the house so that she can display them in her home in the city, in her apartment in the city, because she feels that they're precious, they're special, they deserve an audience beyond the context of the home. And she takes the top of the butter churn to place the churn handle on her alcove table. And when she goes for the quilts, a certain scene arises between the mother and the two sisters, and I'll leave the reading to you. But that idea between why we collect things for cultural heritage and what we think it tells us about a given cultural heritage versus why we engage with things, make things, use things. It's not entirely an argument for use, but it is to ask whether, from an aesthetic perspective, if you are in a field that's full of fireflies, right? You're having an experience. And when you encounter a firefly pinned on a board, right, you might learn certain things about the firefly or of bugs in general, but that experience of the night sky is no longer present. It has receded. And so what kind of museum might allow for, might not cause that recession of the night sky?
Brooke, your answer touched on my question. Could both of you talk a little bit more about how your research is inspiring your teaching?
Much of my teaching in gen ed is around first year composition and thinking through, you know, how to compose, how to make paragraphs hang together and how to compose argumentation. And every now and then, you know, I'm kind of always challenging my students, like we can get weird, like we can go talk about some weird ideas. But every now and then I get to teach a class that is maybe more explicitly configured around some of these ideas. And in the ND block, I taught a class writing about art. And I had a small student group. I think there was maybe 9 of us. Was there 9? Eli was there. And we were able to hop in the Antioch van and go visit various museums. And we read through some of the mostly modernist 20th century canon on what is art, what's the function of art. And in so doing, we could kind of unpack like what is that sort of Western worldview that pervades this version of how we think about art, and how can we phenomenologically encounter art? How do we hermeneutically encounter art? And also just writing good formal qualities about a work, right? So in those ways, I've had some explicit opportunities, but I am lucky that I oftentimes have students that want to talk about weird philosophical ideas that just drop by, and that's such a meaningful experience and an important part of, you know, being here and being part of that community.
Yeah, I can attest to the joy of the after-class discussion that goes on for an extra length. I've always felt a little bit out of place with my literary colleagues. Like I never felt purely lit oriented, partly because my entryway into literary study was through the field of linguistics, and linguistics tries to section off itself and justify its own existence as the scientific approach to language versus the compositional artistic approach to language, where you do need good English professors in the world with a prescriptive set of rules to help you refine your craft. But that's not us. We're the people that are descriptivists, that are just taking what's there. And if you make a mistake, maybe it's not a mistake. Maybe it's just a revelation about how the brain works that helps us understand how people think. And so coming from that approach, I'm often weirdly on the back end of literary conversations. And I know I'm getting around to this kind of by the side door, but I feel like there's a value to noticing that there is an Americanness to American literature and an Ivorianness to an Ivorian literature and a Frenchness to a French literature, even if it's impossible to nail down what that Frenchness or Americanness or Ivorianness actually is. And it's a choice to approach the jello that you can't nail to a tree by actually trying to do it anyway and figuring out why it's slipping off here and there. And so rather than reject the entire idea of categories and only accept fluidity, rather than like it's important to see things in terms of power, but if you only see them in terms of power, you end up in circular logic. And so one way I try to do to avoid that is portable, that is possible from the earliest French courses on up, is to just keep engaged with constant comparisons. And even if your only level of approach is on the level of a stereotype that you know is automatically false because it's a stereotype, you can say to yourself, I am holding back my judgment and still noticing And after my understanding work is done, that I've removed my judgment from that would color all of my understanding, now I can re-engage as a person and decide what I want, what I like about a certain thing. And that allows my thinking about nationhood to help focus on cultural distinctions, to help focus on, and it goes, it can scale up to the advanced courses where we explicitly talk exactly about this and the theoretical underpinnings of it, but you know, in my earliest French classes, you're gonna get shirt, pants, and boo-boo. And if you don't know what a boo-boo is, you're gonna learn what it is, because different people dress differently, and they're not necessarily French because they dress differently, but they're not necessarily not French just because they dress differently. Does that make a little sense? All this question of nationhood is factoring into gender, to how it inflects our experience with our personal selfness as it negotiates with the world beyond us.
Thank you. We have time for maybe one more question, either from the room or online. Simon, Joe?
Yeah, I actually have a question for Brooke. Brooke, my question is, Kevin, my question is for Brooke. Regarding conceptual museum continuing process, preserving, conceptually, what is your input on art that is made specifically for destruction of the physical piece or destruction of as an activist idea? Example for that would be items that are made from Mennonite or Amish communities for relief sales, auction of antique vehicles, you know, that, or we could go into like Bansky and the shredder, but
Yeah.
how do we preserve those types of items?
Yeah, I love that you brought up Banksy in this recent piece about the shredder. So this is a work that went to auction. Was it Sotheby's? Was it yeah, it's a major auction, sold for a preeminent amount of money, and an activator in the back of the canvas started up while everything was still on stage and the focus was on the sold work, and then the shredder activated and began to shred the work, and it's so good. And it malfunctioned. If it didn't malfunction, it would have shredded through the entire work and the work would have fallen to the floor. But the shredder actually malfunctioned and shredded through the painting up to the point where here is the frame and the 3 shredded pieces of the canvas are hanging down, but part of the work still is in the very top of the frame. And I really love this work, and I really appreciate artists who are, you know, kind of exploring the radical edges of what is art. I think when I think of Banksy, I think of a person who is actively pushing at and provoking some of the edges of the art industry and the art world and its capitalist bent. And so for me, that work is really fantastic because I think it provokes all of the questions, right? The artist intent in this instance was that there would be a work made and that the work would destruct. And the work would destruct after a given market value was established for the work. And then the question is, what was the work? Who owns the work? Is there still a work? Does the work still have value? So that provocation of artist intent and of market value is absolutely something that is conceptually imperative for us to think about and to continue to provoke. And really, if you look at the function that has been ascribed to art since the sort of dawn of conceptual art, it is really to provoke the given hegemonic stance of the day, right? Most people writing, you know, through the 20th century about art and the function of art is largely that artists are some of the first to provoke some of the you know, core problems of the world, and that, you know, philosophers come later, right? The artists are toying with the concepts and trying to break free onto some new ground and trying to deconstruct or reconstruct or create some cracks in the oppressiveness of modernity through their work, and that only later can people like philosophers and consider what they've done and wrap theory around it. And I tend to kind of believe that. And that means that that particular piece of art is one of my favorite right now.
Yeah, I guess my question was for community, so. Just, I guess my question was for art that is made like in the sense of community, so quilts, for example. There is quilting as a community event. Then there is quilting to produce an item for sale for that money to destruct some other offset, example, relief sales, things like that. And those are usually produced at a very high rate. Same with cars. We're gonna go ahead and, this is just extra parts, we're gonna go ahead and antique this off. How do we preserve the idea of something that is specifically produced by the artist to be a destructive movement as in activism? So the piece is not important, the movement is important.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'd love to chat with you more to figure out your use of destructive in that sense. Generative is maybe a word that I think I would use to talk about the power of, activism and other things. I don't think I understand your question, but I'll just offer two pieces. When people sell off works, in the quilt community, there's this phenomenon that's really large right now about the cutter quilt. So piles and piles of quilts are sold as cutters, quote unquote. It's a phenomenon that started through eBay. Quilts that are damaged in various states of being have been sold off as cutters. People buy those cutters, they either cut them up or they reincarnate them into new works, or sometimes and now that phenomenon has been around for so many years, I would say maybe about 15 years, that people who are making, for instance, clothing, baseball caps, new works out of old quilts, they're largely making new works out of quilts that the quilt community would not consider to be cutter quilts, meaning there is really no foundational damage to the point that would cause a person focused on quilt repair and restoration to imagine that quilt should be cut up. And so that's one of the things I'm really wrestling with in that chapter is, by what rubric do we say something should be maintained whole versus what rubric would we apply that would allow us to imagine cutting something up? And I think that also goes for the concept of, buggies sold at auction or old cars sold at auction. By what standard do you decide this automobile in its given form should be parted out to become parts of other automobiles versus what automobile, what rubric would suggest that this one is deserving of restoration? And then that kind of brings you to the concept of, well, what is restoration? Is restoration possible? Conceptually, no, there's no way to restore, in my mind, there's no way to actually restore an object. So restoration, conservation, repair, and then different iterative instantiations, which you might call like, the resto mod or the reincarnated quilts, or that's kind of where I'm the most interested. By what measure do we say, okay, this object no longer, it's now a bygone work in and of itself, and let's thrash it and turn it into something new so that it continues to have new audiences, new modes of being, and it's a release of its forces and capacities, which at the end of the day is kind of a Benjamin, a Walter Benjamin. It's a Benjaminian idea. Is that right? Did I get that right? He had this landmark work, of the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction, and he thought that as we moved into photography, that that there was something about technological, the rising technicity in the world was allowing for mechanical reproduction of things that previously had to be made as individual items. And so he talked a lot about photography and cinema and some of his work, but the idea is that an original object has an aura, right? So an old quilt has an aura about it, which is described in various ways. Benjamin does a pretty good job. And that aura is lost when it's reproduced in some other form. So a photo of a quilt that is then dispersed to other people loses its aura, but what it gains is an emancipatory potential because new audiences can encounter that work in ways that they couldn't before. So perhaps not all of us will stand in front of the Mona Lisa, for instance, but if we are able to encounter the Mona Lisa through mechanically reproduced copies of it, we're encountering work that otherwise never would have been encountered in the first place. So these are all really interesting pieces of the canon that are getting some attention and that deserve some long form detail to kind of stretch them out. The place where I'm trying to move, which is difficult, is that all of those things rest in identity. They all rest back with the idea of the original, that there's an original at all that we need to, and that the original somehow has a quality about it, an essential quality about it that guides all future decisions. And that's where Deleuze becomes really fundamental in my thinking, because Deleuze denies the copy. He denies the original, so there can be no copy. And it's an absolute shift in thinking that is difficult, is provocative, is unsettling, and also I think very important and necessary. I don't think that answered your question directly, so I hope we have more conversation around what that looks like.
Yeah. On that note, thank you, Brooke Bryan and Carrie Campbell, for this fascinating afternoon of discussion. And thank you all in McGregor 113 and online. We really appreciate your interest in this. We do have dates for our spring sessions, the second and third in this series. The second one will be on Friday, April 26th, and the third will be Friday, May 10th. So mark your calendars, it'll be 12:30, and we'll feature again 2 faculty for each of those sessions. So thanks so much for attending.
Thank you,
Take care.
Kevin.
Thank you, Kevin. I do more early than most of you,
Yeah,
and so you're making me
I'm
wonder
in-
about the question of
I'm in-
intertextuality.
I am in difference and repetition. It was his.
Are you going to post the recording? Kevin?